Yeah, thanks for attending. This talk is about how to build forms that are better for people, business, and government. So first of all, just introductions. Kia ora, I'm Matthew Holloway from Springload, which is an agency in Wellington, where I also live. So I've been a web developer for about 25 years, and I've always had a strong interest in web accessibility and broader issues of digital inclusion. I live in Island Bay, which is a suburb in Wellington, with my partner and our 3 kids. And I'd probably describe myself as an accessibility enthusiast, not an expert, but I've always been around a lot of this kind of stuff. So on the agenda today, I'd just like to cover, first of all, common ways that forms fail people, businesses, and government, and we'll cover the fundamental purpose of forms and how they're critical to help connect people to services. We'll also cover what do we even mean by making forms accessible? What do these terms mean? Third, we'll give an example of just a very simple example of making something like a text box accessible to WCAG AAA. And WCAG, for those who don't know, is the web standard for accessibility that most governments and organizations refer to. And finally, we'll be talking about form builders and a new form builder that Springload have been developing called Formally. When it comes to form builders, of course, there are many options out there, and it seems like a really saturated market. But we'll cover some ways of evaluating form builders and why Formally has a different take on this category of software. And as Ella said, there'll be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. So first of all, common ways that forms fail. So we could just immediately, jump into talking about like color contrast and making forms that can be navigated with keyboard only, so not with mouse pointers and things like that. Could talk about alt text, could talk about field labels and all of that kind of stuff. But rather than jumping into specific technical advice, it's probably better to cover some fundamentals first. So first of all, what do we even mean by accessible forms? So accessibility in forms is about making forms available to the broadest possible range of people, which will involve catering to the variety of needs that people have, including, but not limited to, their disabilities. For example, 8% of New Zealand males are colorblind. So if a form didn't consider color blindness in its design, then a submit button might have indistinct colors, and 8% of people could be prevented from using it. If people are unable to use forms, this might prevent them from contacting others or accessing government or business services. If a form is a survey, then it's worth noting that accessibility needs are sometimes aligned with demographics, such as age or income, and so inaccessible forms can distort the analysis of survey responses. The organizations receiving the form responses won't be seeing the full picture, of course. Because website forms can be how the public access services, many governments around the world have legal requirements that their websites, including forms, are accessible. And increasingly, this is applied to the private sector too, just like how physical buildings have requirements around wheelchair ramps, for example. But it's not just a legal requirement, the need and the consideration of accessibility. I'd say it's also the right thing to do. Each of us are really only one health emergency away from needing some kind of accessibility support. Accessibility helps to make a better, more inclusive society. So there are many ways of thinking about form accessibility, and it could just be, a technical adherence to web accessibility standards like the aforementioned WCAG. It could also involve service design and making sure that you have a broad range of people involved in that. But today I'd like to start by simply talking about the people using the forms, the users. So I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, which was a long time ago in the 1990s, I had a friend with a physical disability. He had a motor impairment in his arms, in his hands, and that was essentially like a tremor, a shake. He couldn't quite precisely control his arms when using a computer. And so to help with this, he had some assistive technology, which sounds fancy, but in this case, it was essentially a little keyboard table, an overlay that he'd put over the keyboard, and across the surface of the table were many holes, one above every keyboard key. He called the holes wells, and he'd lower his finger into each well to press the keys, and this would prevent him from accidentally dragging his finger across the keyboard and pressing other keys. It was a very simple and effective piece of accessibility technology. The reason why I'm bringing this up today, however, is that from the perspective of a person creating web forms, this kind of assistive technology is really just a keyboard still. And there are many assistive technologies like cameras that do eye tracking or motion tracking, but from the perspective of web forms, they present themselves as conventional mouse pointers or keyboards. So although we should keep in mind the true range of assistive technologies, and in practice, web forms don't and can't cater specially to each one of these assistive technologies individually, and the true variety of these assistive technologies is essentially hidden from web form technology. The upside of this is that it turns out to actually be far easier to support a broad range of user needs and assistive technologies because they've been consolidated and grouped together tech-wise. Conceptually, we can think about these as inputs and outputs of a computer, and here's a non-exhaustive list of some common sort of inputs and outputs. So of course, there'll be the conventional keyboard, mouse, and touch device inputs that people have. And this is often, for accessibility reasons, usually mouse and touch are considered, but sometimes keyboard is missed. So it's important, of course, to check to see whether or not someone can use your forms solely with the keyboard. Autocomplete is also essentially another type of input. It's a little known browser feature where browsers can automatically answer form fields for users. This is when browsers can automatically enter people's real name, their street address, phone number, email, and even credit card details after the user confirms it, I would hope. And this can be a WCAG 2.1 requirement because it can be onerous and unnecessary to provide these details if the browser can simply autocomplete it for them and provide that input. When it comes to outputs, there's the visual, the screen, and the audible, the screen reader. If you haven't used a screen reader before, imagine a computerized voice reading out a web page from top to bottom and describing the possible interactions. So let's talk about how screen readers work, the actual technology of how things are actually put together. Now, this is going to get a little bit technical now. And so we can, if this is too much, it's okay. We'll get back to more higher level concepts soon. So basically what happens when you browse to a web page is that the HTML and CSS and other associated files are downloaded. They're turned into the DOM, the document object model, and also the CSS object model, CSSOM. And these are turned essentially into multiple outputs, the screen pixels, the display, and the accessibility tree, which the screen reader uses in order to audibly speak the web page and read it out. People using a screen reader might be using both outputs at once. So this isn't an exclusive choice where someone using a screen reader doesn't use the screen necessarily. They may have poor eyesight and need assistance from a screen reader, but they might be using both. Any user clicking a link or submitting a form is only interacting with the DOM, not the HTML and CSS files anymore. And in fact, after the HTML and CSS files are downloaded, we can effectively ignore them and simplify this diagram. So people using screen readers interact with the exact same DOM that others do, and making a coherent accessibility tree for screen readers is mostly about using semantic HTML structures in the DOM. There are common accessibility patterns that can be applied to most situations. For those who who prefer more of a visual aid around what the accessibility tree looks like, it's actually possible in most browsers to reveal the accessibility tree that the browser will be exposing to the screen reader. And here is a screenshot, which I'll describe for the people who are using this and aren't able to actually see the screenshot. It's essentially a list of features in the web page, for example, labels, text boxes, headings, and other structural elements to the page. What's important to note here is that the design and other layout-related information has been removed from this. So now we'll just quickly move on to WCAG AAA. WCAG, as I said earlier, is the web standard for accessibility. It has 3 levels of compliance ranging from the minimum, which is single A, all the way to AAA. Depending on your use case, you may need to go further than WCAG AAA, however. For example, WCAG AAA calls for, in some situations, a contrast ratio of 7:1. But studies about using websites in bright outdoors, like in bright sunlight, show that at least a 7.5:1 ratio is necessary. And you can read more about that at the website whocanuse.com. So WCAG is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for accessibility. It should be considered a baseline. And now, as I said, I'd like to go into an example of WCAG AAA compliance for a text box. So a conventional text box might have a label, in this case name, and the box where a user would provide the information, would actually be entering their input to the device. So if we look at the underlying HTML of this, we can see that it would look potentially something like this. At its most basic, a text box needs a label with an input whose IDs line up. You can see that the label 4 has a text box ID, and then the input also has an ID of text box ID. So there's the references between parts of the web page, and that's a way of associating the input with the appropriate label. So when you're considering making, a nice accessibility tree, there's much more to consider than this, though, such as, is the color scheme high contrast enough for WCAG AAA? Is it a required field or not? So required fields need specific HTML attributes to tell the accessibility tree and the user that the field is actually required. Can this field be auto-completed by the browser? Well, in this case, it's asking for the user's name. So yes, it probably can. The autocomplete value of simply name will be sufficient. And when it comes to people's names, there's also the point that in many countries, and I believe it's the same in New Zealand, a last name isn't actually legally required. So a name field tends to be more accessible in the sense that that people may not be able to provide a surname. So a surname field, for example, shouldn't be required. So having a simple name field is generally a better idea. Another thing to consider when making something like this WCAG AAA compliant is whether there's any associated information to help people fill in this form field. So you might think that answering a question about your own name might not need that kind of hint, but what if the person recently changed their legal name and they're not quite sure which name to use? You can associate related hints by using the ARIA described by attribute, which is a space-separated list of IDs pointing at other parts of the web page. So in the same way that we have, in this case, the text box ID, which is a reference between the page, the ARIA described by is another one of these that can point to things by using a specific ID naming convention in the web page. There's also the idea that any field errors should be referenced by ID in the input. In the broader context of a form, there should usually also be a form error summary. And this will be is considered best practice for accessibility reasons, and of course submit buttons and all of that kind of stuff. And of course there's much more to it than this for WCAG AAA, but like I said, this is just an example. It's just a taster of the kinds of considerations that need to go into developing something as simple as a text box. So now that we know a little bit about accessibility, let's try to compare form builders and discover how Formally approaches the problem. So when trying to evaluate form builders and trying to evaluate their accessibility, initially, of course, you might think to look for accessibility compliance statements or conformance reports, as they're sometimes called. So you might want to go look for WCAG compliance reports or Section 508 compliance, which is a US government standard, and that's often where a lot of these form builders were developed in that jurisdiction. But what's important to know, of course, is that this stated compliance is often only referring to a subset of features within the form builder. And even the subset of features within the form builder may only be a subset of accessibility features that the web as a platform itself supports. So I'll give you a specific example of this now. If we consider accessibility features like a field hint with an ARIA described by reference, then this is already something that major form builders don't get right. And if your label has an acronym or an abbreviation, then form builders can even fail at labels themselves. Remember, of course, that using a form builder is just ultimately a way of authoring HTML and maybe CSS if it supports theming. So if we think of HTML as a language, then the vocabulary of accessibility features is controlled and limited by the form builder. Those wishing to use more sophisticated accessibility features can only do so if the form builder supports it. And so accessibility compliance statements alone don't mean that you have access to every accessibility feature. You have to dig deeper than compliance statements, which are necessary but not sufficient for judgment of form builders. So here's how I like to think about it conceptually. So imagine if there's a horizontal line of all of the possible web applications and web forms that could be developed on the web. So on the left, we have website forms that are basic. They have a limited HTML vocabulary and they're relatively cheap to produce. And on the right, we have website forms that are more bespoke, more powerful. They're able to use more accessibility features. And unfortunately, they're also more expensive. So of course, we're going to have form builders on the left. And here's a bunch of popular form builders, such as Wufoo, Formium, Google Forms, Typeform, and Formally. And on the right, we might have bespoke app development, which of course means hiring developers and thinking a lot about money and scope creep and all of that kind of stuff. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that as form builders become more powerful and as they include more accessibility features, the line between these actually starts to change. It means that the form builders start encroaching on the space that once required bespoke apps. Squash, there you go. And that leads to Springload's new form builder, which is called Formally. So Formally is a new form builder that has accessibility considerations built into every relevant feature. So the name Formally comes from the word form, of course, and a popular abbreviation for the word accessibility, which is A11Y, as in A 11 letters and Y, and it's just a common abbreviation for the word accessibility. So one of the reasons why we developed Formally is because in my work life, I was attempting to make websites that were compliant with WCAG AAA typically, but then clients wanted to add a form builder. They wanted to be able to add forms from a form builder on a site. And the existing form builders would actually reduce the standard across the whole site. Anytime one of these forms were added to the site, it would cause problems for any claims of a site being accessible. The other form builders essentially just weren't good enough. So Formally is essentially scratching an itch. It's an itch that many people across the industry seem to have. We've had a lot of interest in Formally, and Formally is aiming to advance the state of the art around form builders. So it has a lot of features, and it's been under development for over 2 years now. Formally is multilingual. It supports developing forms to WCAG AAA. It's been tested on screen readers like NVDA and OSX VoiceOver, as well as mobile screen readers. It's themable. The theme system that we've got in there can distinguish between when a color is used in a background or a foreground, which means we can actually provide automated feedback on whether or not the color schemes that are being chosen comply with WCAG 2.1 color contrast requirements. And we'll soon be looking at getting ahead of WCAG 3, which changes the color contrast formula. There's actually going to be, generally speaking, a wider range of colors available in WCAG 3. There's some non-accessibility features, but features that are important for inclusion and building trust in users, which are around data sovereignty. So I suppose we don't see the value of form builders as necessarily holding the responses. Like by all means, we will hold the user's responses on our servers if you wish. But if you want to submit all the data to your own servers in order to retain that kind of data sovereignty, then that's a choice that you can have and you can decide for yourself. Formally is extensible. You can add your own form fields to it and you can extend it and yet still use the form builder. So often the case when you're looking to develop a form and then you find that there's one particular form field that is quite bespoke for some particular reason, and then you need to redevelop the whole thing outside the form builder in order to reproduce the form, and that can be very expensive. So in the case of Formally, you can actually just extend it with those custom form fields and build upon the existing features of Formally in that case. And there's a large SDK as well, which is the developer tools around this if you need more custom integrations. So as I mentioned, it supports things like multilingualism. So this means that every bit of text that you see in the user interface of a form in Formally is configurable. You can define all of those. We're working on developing a popular library of presets so that you don't necessarily need to speak the language if you're just asking simple questions like name, email, contact details in terms of, street address and things like that. We're developing that as a sort of a library of presets, but it's also possible, of course, just to define your own things, because with any of these questions, you will need to get a translator involved to provide proper translations. So the concept of translations is something that most people are familiar with, of course, but Formally goes a little bit further by supporting localization. So the concept of localization or locales is slightly different to the concept of language translations. Localization is about the difference between New Zealand English and Australian English. They're both English, but they have differences because New Zealand English borrows expressions from many languages, including te reo. So in New Zealand English, an appropriate greeting might be kia ora rather than g'day. Making inclusive forms involves communicating respectfully in a way that builds trust. And although the greeting example might seem trivial, it can involve that kind of difference. All text in a Formally form uses the lang attribute. That's the programming underpinnings of how different languages are put into a web page. And this means that we encourage correct pronunciation by screen readers, such as te reo. Screen readers such as NVDA can use the lang attribute to affect pronunciation, and they do support te reo Māori, providing this is done. So this means that we can actually make forms available and correctly pronounce Māori words. If any of you have used Google Maps and been driving around and hearing Google Maps try to pronounce Māori street names, you will know how badly it can do things. and this is all, so essentially putting the lang attribute in there is a way of fixing that kind of situation, ensuring that correct pronunciation is made. Also Formally tries to detect the language that a user prefers in order to serve up the correct defaults in the language. So if you arrive at a Formally form and your browser is configured to prefer te reo Māori, then it will be serving up that if it's available in the form. Next, I'd like to just quickly talk about a fundamental problem in almost all form builders. A lot of form builders sort of think in lists of items. So they're usually a flat list, and that tends to be a problem. They might happen to split things over multiple pages. So they've essentially got a flat list, but they allow a little bit of separation over multiple pages. But do remember, of course, that form builders are just a way of authoring HTML under the hood. So HTML isn't a flat list, of course, it's a hierarchy, and many accessibility features require supporting that kind of hierarchy. And these features are things like field sets. So informally, you can group related fields into field sets, and you can see in the example there of text box 2 that it's surrounded by a field set. This is just a UX mock-up. This isn't the actual user interface. So as I've mentioned, other features that we have are data sovereignty. So you can send all of the user data, the user responses to your own servers, themable, contrast feedback. You don't need to use iframes for embedding, which can be an accessibility issue in terms of navigating to what's essentially a whole new web page embedded within another. Formally can support repeatable parts of forms, and even repeatable parts of forms in repeatable parts of forms. So I'll give you a practical example with that one. Imagine if you had a form that was asking for people's contact details for related members of the family that they should be contacted in an emergency or something like this. And so they want to be able to add multiple people. And so Formally supports that kind of repeated templating of content within a form. But then a person may have multiple phone numbers. So essentially you want repeatable contact details, and then within each contact detail around that, you want to support multiple emails or potentially multiple phone numbers. And in all of these cases, you can just click add and add those. And so that's all something that's controllable and definable as part of Formally. It also supports conditional parts of forms, so revealing a part of a form based on a preceding answer or based on the locale, the language that a user is currently browsing the form in. And as I mentioned, it supports an SDK. So this SDK has had a lot of polishing, and it's developed in using React and TypeScript. And there's also a plain JavaScript integration if that's what you would prefer, so that it'll actually be embeddable on any web platform. So you can, as I said, you can also add custom fields and arbitrary custom validation logic. And one feature that we're quite proud of is that we support autosuggest. So form builders often don't and can't support autosuggest because of the issues around wiring up an autosuggest component. That's when you type into it and you get like type ahead results displayed. Whereas in this case, what we can do is you just write a little adapter layer of JavaScript, which might be 10 lines of JavaScript, let's say. A developer could provide that. And they don't have to write all of the other accessibility features around autosuggest. So the little adapter layer means that you can connect that to an arbitrary API in order to use autosuggest, like, for example, a street address finder or anything like that. So we've ended 4 minutes early. I probably should speak slower, but that's what nerves will do to me. So yeah, let's open it up for questions.
Thanks for that, Matt. We've got a question from Rebecca. She's popped in the chat. Love the preset-led approach for microcopy in Terreo. Any possible contextual pitfalls to watch out for?
Yes, definitely. It's definitely something that would still need review. There's ways of asking questions that might not, where someone could potentially misuse a preset. For example, if you're asking for someone's name, and it might be as I mentioned earlier, right? The example of if it's someone's birth name versus someone's current name, or any of these kinds of scenarios in the presets where we're giving contextual advice currently in English around the scope of the question of the preset rather, and when it's appropriate to use the preset and when it's not appropriate to use the preset. So we're trying to provide as much information as we can around that. In practice, what people should do if they want to verify all of that, how the form is actually composed and put together, is that of course they'll need to find someone who can actually read the form and verify that it makes sense in context, because yes, the context of questions of course is very important. The idea of presets is to help people along the way and to get them there quicker by providing these kinds of presets, but there still needs to be that review process with any kind of web content, including forms, to make sure that it's actually all put together appropriately. Yep, thanks.
Nice. Rebecca, if you've got the chat open, Matthew. So
I don't actually.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So Rebecca's put great points. Thanks, Matt. We've got a question from Steve saying, does Formally do error summaries when forms have multiple errors?
Yes. So it does error summaries of essentially what's a bulleted list of errors in the current page that's available. So, and I'll describe what error summaries are maybe for the benefit of everyone. So imagine if you're a sighted person, a person who can visually look at forms, and there are 10 form fields on a page, and only one of them has an error, then a sighted person can usually very quickly see the red outline or some kind of error indication, a visual hint that there's some problem with that field, and they can navigate to that field quickly and ignore the ones that are already valid. So the purpose of an error summary is to summarize all of the errors, and that's usually put at the top of a page or top of a form. And then those are like a bulleted list of links down into the page so that you can, so that the person using a screen reader, for example, can navigate to the error summary and then go to that, the list of internal links, and then click on one of those, and then that will immediately direct them down to the specific field that has an error. Because the alternative, of course, is that they're going to have to navigate a lot of content, and they may miss the errors and find it frustrating and yeah, not be able to complete the form. So yes, error summaries are very important around that. There's also a feature that's where we've been developing called an error compass, and the error compass is an alternative, but it is also like an addition to error summaries, where each field can include a link to the preceding and following error, so that the user doesn't need to navigate back to the error summary to find the next error to deal with in the form. Instead, in the particular field, they can just go to the next error, and it will link and line all that stuff up for you. That's something that currently is only supported in the SDK, and it's currently disabled. But if people wish to enable that and experiment with that, we're keen to get your feedback on that feature.
Awesome. Steve popped saying, nice, thanks, great explanation of error summaries. Cool. We have a question from Kay. How much co-design and or pre-testing do you recommend with target audiences? For example, older audiences may have vision issues, younger audiences may have language issues.
Yeah. It's difficult to answer that question. It's sort of how long is a piece of string? It all depends on your confidence level in what you're doing, and how positive the feedback you get from the. I definitely recommend testing anything that gets deployed, and checking, especially for the content and the understanding of the form and all of that kind of stuff. The words being used. Yep, these are all valid points. It's a difficult thing to estimate in terms of hours or success criteria. That tends to be a very individual thing around the projects that you're on and what you're trying to achieve there. The government have some good advice around service design and involving people. That tends to be what a lot of people in the industry in Wellington follow, even for private sector organisations. We'll put a link to that in the follow-up email after this talk around that.
Thanks. Any other questions? Cool. So looks like there's no other questions at the moment. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We will follow up with the transcript and recording, and also a black and white version of the slides. Some really useful feedback from Kay there. Thank you for pointing out that the bright colours can be a bit hard on the eyes. So we will certainly be taking that feedback into account for future presentations as well. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us or my email, which has been in comms. And yeah, thank you.
Nice. Thanks, Ella. Thanks, everyone.